What is up guys, Alex from Lakey Wargames here and welcome to today's video. Today we're going to be talking about the Gothizzar Harvester and why it's still a great unit even after the massive nerf it took. Okay, so I know what you're thinking. When you think Gothizzar Harvester, you get flashbacks to that June 2023 FAQ in which we saw the Bone Harvest rule completely reworded and the Harvester was forever changed in how we use it. Now, granted, the Bone Harvest rule was heavily nerfed only when you compare it to the old version of itself. Unfortunately, in the game, when things change like this, it's just one of those things. There's not a lot we can do about it. The official decision's been made, the rule is now different, and we just have to go forward with the new rules that we're given. Now, a lot of people have turned away from the Harvester, myself included. When the FAQ first dropped, I was just like, nope, I want no more Mortek Guard, I want no more Harvesters. At 210 points, it was definitely not worth it in the way that we're used to running it compared to how it used to work. But I think we've all got the wrong sort of mindset and maybe we're a bit overly harsh on the Harvester. The July 2023 FAQ saw it drop 30 points, so it's now only 180, and to be honest, I've been looking at the Harvester more and more since this change, and I think with the Bone Harvest rule completely changing, we have to, as OBR players, change our mindset about how we use the unit. Maybe this unit is no longer the big healing support piece that it once was, but it still has plenty of utility within our lists, and there are different ways that we can utilise it now. At the end of the day, it's still a Gothizzar Harvester, it still has an awesome combat profile in my opinion, and it still has the ability to heal things, but we just have to make sure we pre-plan and rework our tactics around the way that the Harvester now works, instead of keep comparing it to the old way. The old way was great, but it's gone, so it's time to move on. And in today's video, I want to be taking you through all the different ways that we can run the Gothizzar Harvester, and there are a few ways that I really like, especially using it as now a combat support piece instead of a healing support piece. We're going to look at both. We're going to look at both healing and combat potential of the Harvester, but there are quite a few combos that maybe you haven't thought of, maybe we haven't seen, because we're so used to relying on the Bone Harvest as the Gothizzar Harvester's main system that this may shock you in how good at 180 a Gothizzar Harvester can be. So, with all that said, I think it's time to move on to some ways that we can make this Harvester absolutely awesome. Now, as I said in the intro, I think as OBR players we sort of owe it to ourselves, we owe it to our army to be able to adapt to the changes. After all, that's what OBR is all about. The big command structure, they use their tactics, and depending what their opponent is doing, we adapt, overcome, and we sort of reply to the situation in tow with what we can. Now, I think with the Bone Harvest being changed the way it was, the way we should see the Gothizzar Harvester is as a combat support monster first and a secondary healer second. Now, there are so many things that we can do in this book to make the Harvester really cool. Like I said, Bone Harvest is changed, but its weapon profiles have stayed the same, and in my opinion, the Harvester was always sort of underrated as a combat monster. It was often kept behind a Mortek line because the Bone Harvest was so vital to the healing to the Mortek Guard. You didn't want it to get unnecessarily killed in combat by putting it out of position, getting it into a fight, getting it hurt, getting it killed, because it was a big priority for your opponent to take out. But now that its healing isn't so vital to us, we've got many other things that we can lean on to do healing instead. We should have no problem throwing our Harvesters forward, and there are so many buffs in this book that make the Harvester go absolutely insane. So let's bring up the Harvester's weapon profiles before we get into it and see what it's got for us going at base. It has 1 missile weapon and 2 melee weapons going for it. Don't forget that it's still a 10 wounds with a 4+ save monster. So first things up is a missile weapon, the Death's Head Maw. 16-inch range, not bad. Not very short, it's not very long, it's a nice medium range weapon, which for a combat army you're going to be up in their faces anyway, so 16 inches is perfectly fine to shoot multiple targets, I'm sure. 4 attacks with a 3+ to hit, a 3+ to wound, -1 rend and 1 damage. Nothing to write home about, but for little chip damage here and there, it all adds up over the course of a game. Now we have two melee weapons. We have the Soul Cleaver Sickles or Soul Crusher Bludgeons, and we also get to attack with the Ossified Hooves and Tail. For the Sickles or Bludgeons, you get 6 attacks, hit on a 3, wound on a 3, -2 rend and 2 damage. Again, nothing too crazy, but at the same time that's not bad at all. And the Ossified Hooves and Tails have 4 attacks, hit on a 3, wound on a 3, -1 rend and 2 damage. So already we have 10 attacks in melee with a potential damage output of 20 wounds, which for a 180 point model, being able to kill 20 guys, potentially, is not bad at all. Now, we take that base profile and there are a few things that we can give it that really send it into the stratosphere. The first one and the big one is Catacross. Catacross is in a lot of lists anyway, but if you add him with the Gothizzar Harvester and he pops the Supreme Lord of the Bonereaper Legions, then your Harvester is going to get +1 to save, so he's now a 10 wound monster with a 3+ save, and he also gets +1 to hit. Now that +1 to hit isn't just limited to melee weapons, that +1 to hit is just on everything. So even now the Death's Head Maw is hitting on 2s, as well as your Bludgeons, Sickles and Hooves or Tail, all hitting on 2s, so your chances of being able to land that damage goes up very, very nicely. The nice thing about this is it's a CP spent on Catacross, so that still opens the Harvester up for other doors later down the line. So the next buff that I want to talk about for the Harvester isn't one that I think is going to be a very popular choice. It isn't one that I'd usually recommend burning a CP on, but you can use your Liege Cavalos's Endless Duty command to be able to give the Harvester +1 attack. Now this +1 attack goes onto both of his weapon profiles, so you get 1 to your big attack and 1 to the Hooves and Tails. So you now have a total of 12 attacks and a damage output of 24. With some of the other buffs that we're going to be talking about that you can put onto the Harvester, in the right situation, sometimes those extra 2 attacks can be really, really clutch if you really need something dead and your Harvester is the only one that you think is capable of doing it. But usually I would use Endless Duty somewhere else on a unit with more attacks. But again, situationally dependent, it's nice to know that you can give the Harvester +2 attacks there. Moving on to our third buff for the Harvester, and that is going to the Mortison Ossifector. Now he is the new hero that we got with our brand new Battle Tome, and he is really, really nice paired with the Harvester. He has his Refined Creations ability, where in the hero phase you get to pick a Harvester, Crawler or Morghast within 12 inches, and you get to pick one of the following augmentations to apply until the next hero phase, which is really nice because if you're going first, you can put this buff onto a Harvester. It will last through the enemy's turn, so you get it in your combat phase and their combat phase, and then when it loops back to your turn, you can put it on again. He also has his Empower Ossification spell, so he's able to pick. There's 2 of the buffs that can affect the Harvester in this list, and you can be able to put that up to 3 different units. So if you are running multiple Harvesters, you can be able to put these buffs on multiple Harvesters. So the 2 that we're going to look at, the first one is probably the lesser used one, and that is the Accelerated Calcification. That allows the Harvester to ignore the first wound or mortal wound caused to it in each phase. This is really nice for being able to close the distance, get your Harvester into combat. If it's getting hit by sort of magical range damage, or if it's getting hit by like a splash AoE, something like a Teclis, or using his Searing White Light. If you're getting shot at, it's nice to shrug off the first wound or mortal wound that you take in that phase as you're going in. So you can ignore the first one in the hero phase if you get hit by magic, you can ignore the first one in the shooting phase if you get shot at. Then if you've got charge, you can ignore the first one in the combat phase. So it's kind of nice. Once you're in combat though, I would recommend using the next one, and that is the Ossified Barbs, which improves the rend characteristics of your melee weapons by 1. So that's going to make our big attacks now rend 3 and our Hooves and Tail rend 2, which considering they are 2 damage each is very nice. Having 6 attacks at 3s, rend 3, 2 damage is nothing to sort of turn your nose up at. And if you think we're going to already combine that with someone like a Catacross, you're now hitting on 2s, you've got rend 3, damage 2, for a 180 point hero, it's not a hero, sorry, for a 180 point combat support piece, it's adding up quite nicely. The next thing that you can do with the Ossifactor is if you give him his signature artifact, the Gothizzar Cartouche, he gives +1 wound to all melee weapons within 9 inches of him. So now you can see where this is really going to stack up. If you've got Catacross in your list, you're giving your Harvester +1 to hit. If you've got a Gothizzar Cartouche nearby babysitting your Harvester, he gets +1 to wound. So now your attacks, you've got 6 attacks, hitting on 2s, wounding on 2s. If you use the ossified barbs, you're now Rend 3 and 2 damage. And with your other profile, you're still 2s, 2s, Rend 2, 2 damage. If you use a Liege Cavalos, you're now buffing those attacks on each profile with a really nice rend, which is awesome. Another little trick that you can put in on top is from someone else. If you get a wizard to cast the Drain Vitality spell, which only has a casting value of 6, so it's quite easy to cast even with someone like a Boneshaper or the Ossifactor himself. You don't necessarily need Arcan to push this spell out, and especially with the current General's Handbook that's out with the Andor and the Primal dice, you get to add d6 to your casting. You can really try and push out Drain Vitality with any caster really. And this makes an enemy unit -1 to hit and -1 to save, which essentially basically gives you another rend if you're thinking about it. So if you're using ossified barbs and you've got Drain Vitality off, you're now basically adding 2 to the rend, so your main attacks are now Rend 4, hitting on 2s, wounding on 2s, so that can be really nice. And if you want to push this even further, and if you really need something dead, say you're playing against Stormcast, those pesky Annihilators with their 2+ armor save, and you're just going to go, what armor save? You can even use Bludgeon as your command in the combat phase to give yourself another point of rend. So you're now at +2 to rend because of the ossified barbs and the bludgeon command, and then the enemy is now -1 to save because you cast Drain Vitality on them. You're now adding essentially 3 rend to your profile. So that's going to make your Soul Cleaver Sickles or Soul Crusher Bludgeons Rend 5, and it's going to make your Hooves and Tail attacks Rend 4, and they are all damage 2. If you're using the Cartouche and Catacross as well, again you're hitting on 2s, wounding on 2s, and that is just a really beefy profile. Liege Cavalos aside, I mean, you can buff this to 7 attacks, hitting on 2s, wounding on 2s, -5 rend, 2 damage, and then you can have 5 attacks, 2s, 2s, -4 rend, 2 damage. Again, I probably wouldn't use the Liege Cavalos unless you really need something with high armor dead. But yeah, you can make the Gothizzar Harvester an absolute machine at cutting through armor. Again, that's a lot of things to stack together, but at the same time it also isn't. If you've got Catacross and the Ossifactor, again, don't even think about the Liege Cavalos, just the Catacross and the Ossifactor. You need 1 artifact and 1 CP, and you can really make that work. Then if you add in 1 spell and a further CP for 2 CP, that's when you take this profile into absolute silly territory, where you're at the -5 rend. Again, it's very situational. You're not going to be have to using the spell and sort of the extra CP every turn, but for just 1 CP and 1 artifact in your list, you can turn Harvesters into absolute nightmare fuel for anyone who's got an armor save and no ward to be able to shrug that off. Don't forget that on top of all of this, you are still a monster, so you're going to be also using your monstrous actions. This means you can stomp or you can roar. Again, it's all situationally dependent, depending what you need your monster to do at that time. Depends which one you pull out, but being able to shut off the enemy sort of commands, so if you roar at them and then you go and cut them all to pieces, again, something like Stormcast that's really sort of low model count but really high armor, you're now taking away that armor, you're now taking away their ability to Inspiring Presence because you've roared on them, and then hopefully you're going to make the last couple of guys run away. And that's how I'm personally seeing the Harvester at the moment. I think for 180 points, I'm a big fan of Catacross and the Gothizzar Cartouche wielding Ossifactor myself personally, because I love using them in conjunction with Immortus Guard. You can do the same sort of thing where you take the Immortus Guard's profile, you give them +1 to hit, you give them +1 to wound, you can use something like Bludgeon or their pile in twice, and they can start doing a lot of work. Now I'm thinking for 180 points, because I'm already using those buffs, if I just stick a Harvester right next to those Immortus Guard, it just makes them so much more scary. And being able to pump the rend through the roof like that, as and when needed, again, you do have to spend quite a few resources on this, but you're building around it. You know that this is in your back pocket, you know that it's one of the tactics that you want to be pulling out. Taking the Harvester and bumping its combat profile up as well will also allow you to use the battle tactic in the book, which requires the Harvester to kill an enemy monster or hero. So if for whatever reason in a situation your Harvester, it opens up, that you can charge your Harvester into a little 5 wound hero. With a profile like that, even just adding the +1 hit, +1 wound, chances of you thumping down a little 5 wound hero are very, very good in your favour, and you can score a battle tactic through it that way. Again, if they've got a monster and it goes down to just a few wounds through other combats, you want to pile the Harvester in to finish it off, then you can. But I think this is the main way that we're going to be seeing the Harvester at current, until Mortek Guard come down, and then we can go back to its healing. And speaking of healing, it still has its uses. I know it isn't compared to what it used to be, the Bone Harvest rule has completely changed, but as I said in the beginning, we just have to change our mindsets and the ways that we think about using the Harvester for its healing profile. Again, if you're using all these buffs from before, then you're going to be using it as a scary combat monster, and this heal will come second to you. The heal is still very useful because we want to be in combat as much as possible, and so dying in combat isn't the worst. Healing at the end of the combat phase, we just have to make sure that we're picking our fights so our units aren't getting wiped out before the Harvester has chance to trigger. And this will require you to have strong healing from other sources to keep your units topped up until you can reach that end of combat phase and the Harvester can kick in. But thankfully, healing elsewhere outside of the combat phase is something that the OBR book is not short of. We have Catacross, we have Arcan, we have a Boneshaper. The Boneshaper can take the Artisan's Key, and we also have access to the Emerald Lifeswarm Endless spell if you really wanted to. If you had all of those in your list, and you were able to get them all off, that means you could return 15 more tech a turn to a single unit, and when you've got Catacross and Arcan who can affect up to 3 units, then yeah, you can put a lot of bodies back on the table. And say if you're running a big block of like 30 Mortek Guard, the chances of your opponent being able to run through 30 Mortek Guard while they've also got +1 save from Catacross, if you use something like all-out defense or the shield wall, depending on the situation and what the enemy is you're fighting, you can buff your deathless ward save from a 6+ to a 5+ with a CP, again depending on the situation, what you're fighting, what you might need. Your opponent being able to cut through 30 Mortek Guard in one fell swoop is something that's going to be very spectacular, and they're going to need something super punchy to be able to do it. Again, don't forget, as OBR we are all immune to battle shock, so that means 30 Mortek Guard. Even if 29 of them died, doesn't matter, they're not going to run away. You just need that one guy left to be able to top the unit back up. And because you want to be in combat, that's where the Harvester heal is going to shine through. But again, if your Mortek are starting to get low on numbers, if you've only got sort of 10 guys left, or you're running MSU, just try and think of different ways to be able to make sure you're not getting thumped so hard so fast, and your Mortek won't disappear. I've never really been a big fan of running MSU Mortek. For screening, I much prefer using Kavalos Death Riders. I think Mortek are great in a blob, and you have to really build around it, and go sort of high bodies and just really punish your opponent for not being able to deal with that, and they'll go after your support pieces, but then they get bogged down by the Mortek Guard. And again, there's so much healing everywhere that you just make sure the Harvester is sort of that cherry on the top. And if it doesn't go well for you, then in your hero phase, you've planned it out and mapped it in such a way that you're going to just heal back from other places, and your Harvester can just carry on thumping people in the face, which is, if you take it for that primarily, then the healing is just sort of extra bonus guys back to life at the end of your combat phase. So that about wraps it up for our Harvester and some of the ways that you can really buff him, and that I think that we as OBR players should be changing our mindset. The rule, unfortunately, Bone Harvest going away, is very painful, but we can't live in the past forever. We just have to sort of move on with the way that the Harvester works as his current profile. So really stacking them buffs on and using him as a combat support monster is personally the way that I see the Harvester going forward. All those different things, being able to stack on him, you can sort of pick and choose your poison. You can make him as strong as you like. You could even just add sort of one of those buffs in if you just have the Ossa factor. Again, you don't need the cartouche, making him go 2s and 2s, and 5 rend is just something absolutely silly and fun. And situational. You're not always going to need 5 rend, so it doesn't have to be such a resource sink. I know that that entire list of things I rattled off to make the perfect harvester profile is a lot of resources, a lot of eggs in one basket to make the harvester work, but like I said, you can pick and choose your poison on what you have. If you've just got Catacross in there, +1 hit save is fine, but then again you still have access to your Ossiarch commands at all times, so you'll be able to use bludgeon. You're still the monster, so you can still roar on units, etc. If you don't have Catacross and you've just got the Ossifactor, then you can still choose that +1 rend. You still have access to the cartouche in your list. Maybe you go Warlord Battalion, so you don't have to give up the Artisan's Key. Then you get both. You get the extra healing for a Bonereaper in your list, and you're giving +1 wound to your units. And don't forget that if you do take these guys, like I said, I use them alongside a Mortar's Guard, but you can really use those buffs if you're taking Catacross and an Ossifactor anyway. Sure, they have to be nearby the Harvester, or, well, Catacross not so much because his is a 24-inch bubble, but the Ossifactor has to stay within 9. But don't forget that it's also buffing everything else in your list, so if you have a wall of Mortek Guard, your Mortek Guard are now also going to be +1 hit, +1 wound, +1 save. So as well as you putting these buffs onto your harvester, because of the bubbles, it does allow you to affect more than just your harvesters. So don't think of these resources as a sink just into a harvester, but on your army as a whole. And if you can just tuck the harvester, because it's such a small base for such a fantastic model, in my I was surprised when I saw how smaller base the harvester actually is when I saw one in person for the first time. He's quite easy to keep within those bubbles on the side of a unit, and then be able to buff him and something else at the same time. So don't just see these as resource investments into the harvester alone. You can use this sort of army wide, and you're just sort of tucking the harvester in there as a little 180 point missile to be able to throw into the enemy, crank up that rend at the last minute, and then they think, oh dear, I thought the harvester was for healing, and now it's just punched half my unit into oblivion. So yeah. But let me know what you guys think. What do you think of the harvester? Has anything I've mentioned today changed your mind? Do you see any of these buffs being something that you might be adding into your list? Or is it still a bit too sore? Do you still think the harvester is just not worth it at 180 for that sort of combat potential, and that the units that you bring with it just aren't worth putting into your list? Let me know your thoughts and comments down below. As always guys, stay safe and happy wargaming. Psst! Hey you! Did you know that Lakey Wargames now has an official eBay store? You can buy yourself all kinds of pre-painted and new on sprue hobby goodness and support the channel at the same time. There's a link in the description below if you want to check it out. I'd greatly appreciate it, and it's a fantastic way to support the channel. Okay, see you in the next one.